Imagine for a second the coldest you have ever been. Maybe your heater busted in the middle of January, or you got caught in a snowstorm without a heavy coat. You know that feeling. That sharp sting where your fingers go numb and your breath feels like it is freezing right inside your lungs. Now, take that feeling, multiply it by about 100, and imagine there is absolutely no thermostat to turn up. There are no heated seats, no heavy-duty insulation in your walls. Just you, a drafty wooden shack, and a winter that doesn't just want to make you shiver, it wants to erase you. Welcome to the brutal reality of the Middle Ages. We're talking about a time when winter wasn't just a season, it was a survival horror story that lasted 4 to 5 months. You're drifting along the dreamless timelines. I'm your guide through the fog of history. Tonight, we aren't looking at knights in shining armor or epic battles under the sun. We're going to hunker down and look at the gritty, freezing, and honestly pretty terrifying reality of how people survived or didn't survive the medieval freeze. We're going to dig into the weird medical beliefs, the starvation, the wolves waiting in the dark, and the strange coziness of sleeping next to your cow just to stay warm. So get comfortable. Pull that blanket up a little higher. Make sure you are warm. And hey, while you're settling in for this long, cold journey, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and thumbs up this video. It helps us keep the fire burning here at Dreamless Timelines, so we can keep bringing you these stories to help you drift off. Ready? Let's step out into the snow. To understand why this was such a nightmare, we have to talk about the weather itself. You see, around the early 14th century, the world entered a phase that scientists and historians call the Little Ice Age. This wasn't just a regular cold snap. This was a global shift. The average temperatures dropped significantly. We are talking about the Thames River in London freezing over so solid that they held fairs on top of it. Booths, games, roasting pigs, the whole 9 yards right on the ice. But before the festivals, there was the fear. In the medieval mind, winter was associated with death, literally. The days got shorter, the light faded, and the darkness took over. For a peasant living in the 1300s in Europe, the sun setting at 4 in the afternoon wasn't just depressing, it was dangerous. There were no street lights. If you didn't have candles, and beeswax was expensive, folks, so you're probably burning smelly animal fat, you were sitting in total, absolute darkness. Imagine sitting in a hut in rural France or England. Outside, the snow is drifted up to your window, if you even have a window, which you probably don't. Just a hole in the wall with a wooden shutter. The wind is howling like a banshee, and you know deep in your bones that you won't see green grass again for months. It is a level of isolation that we, with our internet and cell phones, can't really wrap our heads around. It was just you and the silence. Let's talk about where you are sleeping. If you're picturing a stone castle with roaring fireplaces in every room, let me stop you right there. That is the Hollywood version. Even for the rich, stone castles were basically giant refrigerators. Stone holds the cold, it radiates it. If you touched the wall of a castle bedroom in January, your hand might stick to it. But for the 90% of the population, the peasants and the serfs, it was way sketchier. Your house is likely made of wattle and daub. Sounds fancy? It's not. It's basically woven sticks covered in a mixture of mud, straw, and, well, animal dung. That's your insulation.
That is what is standing between you and a blizzard. Over time, that mud cracks. The wind finds every single gap. You would be stuffing moss or straw into the cracks in the walls every single day just to stop the draft from freezing your toes off. And the floor? Dirt. Just packed earth. In the summer, it is dusty. In the winter, it is a block of ice. If you were lucky, you covered it with rushes, which are dried grasses. But here's the gross part we usually skip in history class. Those rushes weren't changed very often. They collected food scraps, bugs, and other bodily fluids. It was a compost heap you were living on top of. But hey, decomposition creates heat, right? Now, how do you heat this place? You don't have a chimney. Chimneys were actually high-tech luxury items for a long time. Instead, you have an open fire pit right in the middle of the room. The smoke is supposed to drift up and out of a hole in the roof. But wind is tricky. Half the time, the wind blows down the hole, pushing the smoke back into the room. So your winter reality is a choice. Do you want to freeze or do you want to suffocate? Most people chose a little bit of both. You would be coughing, eyes watering, lungs filling with soot, just trying to stay warm. It is no wonder archaeologists find medieval skeletons with serious sinus and lung issues. They were basically smoking a pack a day just by sitting in their living room. But here's the real kicker, and this is where it gets kind of cozy in a weird barnyard sort of way. You aren't alone in that one-room hut. If you had a cow, a goat, or a pig, that animal was your most valuable possession. It was your bank account on legs. You aren't going to leave your bank account outside in negative 20 degrees to freeze to death or get eaten by wolves. No way! You bring them inside. At night, the layout of a peasant house was basically a cuddle puddle of humans and farm animals. The animals were usually tethered at one end of the room, often slightly lower down so their waste would flow away from the sleeping area. But the smell? You can imagine. However, and this is a big however, a cow radiates a lot of body heat. A pig is like a little space heater. Families would sleep huddled together, often in one big bed if they had one, or on a pile of straw mattresses. Mom, dad, kids, grandma, maybe the dog, all packed like sardines. And right next to you, the gentle breathing of the family cow. It sounds gross to us, but back then that was survival. That body heat was the difference between waking up in the morning and, well, not waking up. And speaking of not waking up, let's talk about the gear. What are you wearing to bed? You don't have thermal pajamas. You are likely sleeping in the same wool tunic you wore all day. Maybe you take off the outer layer, but you keep the linen undershirt on. Wool was the MVP of the Middle Ages. It keeps you warm even when it's wet. It's itchy, it smells like wet sheep, but it works. You would pile sheepskins over you, cloak yourself in whatever heavy fabric you had, and just pray the fire didn't go out. Morning comes. The rooster crows, assuming the rooster isn't frozen solid. You wake up and the first thing you see is your breath misting in the air inside your house. There's frost on the inside of the door. The water in the bucket you left out is solid ice. You have to break it just to get a drink. The first mission is the fire. If the embers died out overnight, you're in a tight spot. Matches don't exist. You have to use flint and steel, striking a spark into dry tinder with numb, shaking fingers. If you can't get it lit, you might have to run, literally run, to a neighbor's house, borrow a burning coal, and carry it back in a clay pot or on a shovel, shielding it from the wind with your body. Can you imagine that? Your morning coffee run is actually a morning fire run, just so you don't freeze. This community aspect was huge. You couldn't be a loner in the Middle Ages. If you were an introvert who hated people, winter was going to be really rough for you. You needed your neighbors. If your crop failed, if your woodpile ran out, if your fire died, you relied on the village. It was a we society, not a me society, purely out of necessity. Now, we talked about the cold, but what about the mind? What do you do when the sun goes down at 4 in the afternoon and you can't go outside because the snow is waist deep? You didn't have Netflix.
You didn't have books. Most people couldn't read anyway. Winter was incredibly boring. It was a test of mental endurance. This is where storytelling became the lifeblood of culture. This is why we have fairy tales. People would sit around that smoky fire, repairing tools, spinning wool. Women were always spinning wool, literally all the time. And they would talk. They told stories of monsters, of saints, of local gossip. But the darkness outside played tricks on the mind. The howling wind sounded like spirits. The scratching at the door could be a wolf, or it could be a demon. This is why medieval folklore is so creepy. It was born in the dark, in the cold, when people's minds were starved for stimulation. If you are enjoying this dive into the dark, frozen past, make sure you are subscribed to Dreamless Timelines. We've got a lot more winter to get through. But it wasn't just boredom. It was cabin fever on steroids. You're stuck in a 400 square foot hut with your parents, your in-laws, your 5 kids, and a goat. Tempers flared. Records from medieval courts show that violence and arguments spiked in the winter. People literally got on each other's nerves until they snapped. It was a long, claustrophobic lockdown that happened every single year. Let's shift gears to your stomach. You're hungry, but it is February. The harvest was months ago. What are you eating? This period, specifically late winter and early spring, was known as the hunger gap. The fresh food is long gone. The apples are eaten or rotten. The root vegetables in the cellar are getting soft and sprouting eyes. You're living on salted meats and preserved grains. Salt was the refrigerator of the ancient world. Everything was salted. Salted pork, salted fish, salted beef. It was so salty that you had to soak the meat in water for hours just to make it edible. And even then, it tasted like eating a salt lick. And bread. Bread was life. But not the fluffy white bread, you know. We're talking dense, dark rye or barley bread. Sometimes, if the grain supply was running low, they would mix in things to bulk it up. Ground up beans, peas, or even acorns. In really desperate times, and this is where it gets sad, people would mix dirt or sawdust into the dough just to make it feel like they were eating something. There were no vitamins, no vitamin C. Scurvy wasn't just a sailor's disease, it hit landlocked peasants in the winter too. Your gums would bleed, your joints would ache, and you would feel constantly tired. They didn't know it was because they weren't eating oranges, they just thought it was the winter sickness. But while you were starving inside, something else was starving outside. And this brings us to one of the most terrifying aspects of a medieval winter: the predators. In the summer, wolves stayed deep in the forests. They had plenty of deer and rabbits to eat. But in a brutal winter, like the ones during the Little Ice Age, the game animals died off or hibernated. The wolves got hungry. And when wolves get hungry, they lose their fear. There are historical records from Paris in the 1400s where a pack of wolves actually entered the city through breaches in the walls. They didn't just rummage through trash, they hunted people. This wasn't a movie, this was real life. Imagine walking home at twilight, the snow crunching under your boots, and seeing a pair of yellow eyes reflecting the moonlight at the end of the alley. We left off with a shadow at the end of the alley. Now let's zoom in on a specific winter
that was so brutal, it sounds like absolute fiction. The year is 1450. The place is Paris. Now, Paris in the 1400s wasn't the romantic city of light. It was crowded, smelly, and surrounded by walls. And outside those walls, the winter had killed everything. The deer were gone, the boars were gone, so a pack of wolves, desperate and starving, did the unthinkable. They moved into the suburbs. This wasn't just a couple of stray dogs. This was a coordinated pack led by a massive wolf that the locals actually named. They called him Courteau, which basically means bobtail, because he was missing part of his tail. Courteau became a celebrity, but the bad kind. He and his pack breached the city walls. Imagine walking to the market to buy some stale bread, and suddenly a pack of wolves bursts out from an alleyway. Historical records claim they killed 40 people in the heart of the city.
40. It got so bad that the citizens of Paris couldn't take it anymore. They didn't have animal control to call. They were on their own. The people eventually lured the pack into the square in front of Notre Dame Cathedral. They barricaded the wolves in and, well, let's just say it was a total showdown. The townsfolk stoned the wolves to death right on the steps of the cathedral. It is a gruesome story, I know, but it paints a picture. Winter wasn't just cold, it was a war zone. Nature was invading civilization because nature itself was starving. If you think your commute is rough because of a little slush on the road, just remember Courteau, the wolf, waiting by the cathedral. Speaking of commuting, let's talk about getting around. You might think that in winter, everyone just stayed put. And mostly they tried to, but life had to go on. Merchants had to sell, messengers had to deliver news, and sometimes you just had to get out of Dodge. Here is the weird paradox of medieval travel. Sometimes winter was actually the best time to travel. Hear me out. In the spring and autumn, the roads were basically rivers of mud. If you had a heavy cart loaded with timber or stone, it would sink to the axles. You were stuck. Game over. But in deep winter, the mud froze into rock-hard earth. The potholes filled with ice. Suddenly, the world was paved. You could move heavy goods way faster on a sled or a cart over frozen ground than you ever could through the mud. However, this came with a high-stakes gamble. The rivers, which were the main highways of Europe, would freeze over. We aren't talking about a thin layer of crust. We're talking about ice thick enough to march an army across, which they actually did. But ice is unpredictable. There are countless stories and chronicles of travelers crossing a frozen river, feeling confident, maybe a little too confident, and then crack. That sound. The sound of the ice giving way is probably the scariest sound a medieval traveler could hear. If you fell in, you were done. There was no rescue squad. Hypothermia in that water would take you out in minutes. The weight of your wool clothes soaking up the water would drag you down like an anchor. But humans are a strange bunch. We find ways to party even in the apocalypse. When the fear of the ice subsided, the frost fairs began. The most famous ones were on the River Thames in London. The river was wider and slower back then, and the old London Bridge blocked the flow of ice, creating a massive solid ice sheet. It was like a temporary continent appeared in the middle of the city. Instead of hiding, people set up shop. They built tents on the ice. They roasted entire oxen over giant bonfires right on the river. Can you imagine the smell of roasting meat wafting through the freezing air? There were bowling alleys made of ice, puppet shows, and even souvenir shops selling trinkets that said, "I survived the frost fair."
It was surreal. You could walk across the river, buy a hot gin, watch a bear baiting show, which was awful but popular, and dance on the frozen water. It was a brief moment where the terror of winter was turned into a carnival. But it was fleeting. A sudden thaw could, and sometimes did, send the whole party crashing into the water. It was a live fast, die young vibe, medieval style. Now, let's say you survived the wolves and the frozen river, but you woke up with a cough. You're feeling feverish. What do? You go to the doctor. But the medieval doctor isn't going to give you antibiotics. He's going to look at your pee, consult a star chart, and probably tell you that your humors are out of whack. Medieval medicine was based on the ancient Greek idea of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. They believed your body was a container of these fluids, and sickness was just an imbalance. Winter was associated with phlegm. Winter was cold and wet. Therefore, if you were sick in winter, it meant you had too much cold and wet energy in your body. The cure? You needed to get hot and dry. This meant your diet had to change. You weren't allowed to eat cold foods like fish or raw vegetables. You needed hot foods. And the hottest things they knew were spices: pepper, cinnamon, cloves, ginger. These weren't just flavorings, they were high-grade pharmaceuticals. If you were rich, you would drink spiced wine called Hippocras to literally heat your blood.
If you were poor, well, you couldn't afford pepper. You probably just ate more onions and garlic, which were also considered hot. So the poor population of Europe basically spent the winter smelling like a giant garlic press. But hey, if it keeps the phlegm away, right? Now here is a public service announcement from a 14th century doctor. Do not take a bath. Seriously. In the winter, bathing was considered suicidal. The logic went like this: hot water opens your pores. If your pores are open, the bad air, the miasma, and the cold can enter your body and kill you instantly. So people didn't bathe for months. They believed that a layer of dirt and the body's natural oils actually formed a protective shield against the cold. And in a way, they weren't totally wrong. Grease does insulate. But imagine the smell inside that small sealed-up hut we talked about earlier. Smoke, animal manure, rotting rushes, garlic breath, and unwashed bodies. It was a sensory nightmare. But they didn't care about smelling like roses. They cared about waking up the next morning. If the garlic and the no bathing rule didn't work, the doctor might suggest the ultimate cure-all, bloodletting. Yes, even in the dead of winter, when you are weak and freezing, they might decide you have too much blood. They would open a vein and drain you a bit. The idea was to release the toxins and rebalance the heat. In reality, it just made you weaker, colder, and more likely to pass out. It is a miracle anyone survived the doctor, let alone the disease. While we're on the topic of survival, if you're finding these stories fascinating and you want to make sure you don't miss the next part of this frozen saga, double check that you are subscribed to Dreamless Timelines. We are building a library of history to help you relax, and we would love to have you with us. Let's shift to fashion, or rather, the desperate attempt to cover your skin. Today, if you want a warm coat, you go to the store and buy a puffer jacket. Back then, warmth was a status symbol. There were actual laws called sumptuary laws that dictated what you were allowed to wear based on how much money you had. It was illegal, literally a crime, for a peasant to wear certain types of fur. If you were a king or a duke, you wore ermine or sable. These are incredibly dense, warm furs. You were walking around in a cloud of warmth.
If you were a merchant, maybe you could wear fox or beaver. But if you were a peasant, you were stuck with the bottom of the barrel. You wore sheepskin, which is actually pretty good but heavy. Or if you were really broke, you wore the skins of whatever you could catch. Cat skin, dog skin, rabbit skin, badger skin. Imagine wearing a vest made of your neighbor's cat because it was the only thing stopping you from freezing. It sounds harsh, but nothing was wasted. When an animal died, it became clothing. They layered up. A linen shirt underneath to catch the sweat and lice, then a wool tunic, then another wool tunic, then a hood, then a cloak. And they didn't take this stuff off. You slept in it. You worked in it. You lived in it until spring. We talked about the physical cold, but we have to touch on the darkness again. Today, we call it seasonal affective disorder. We have special lamps for it. Back then, they just called it melancholy. They believed the cold black bile of winter made people sad, sluggish, and depressed. And without electric lights, this was a massive problem. The only light was firelight, the flickering orange glow. It creates a trance-like state. If you stare into a fire for long enough, your mind starts to wander. This is where the mysticism comes in. People saw visions in the fire. They hallucinated. Was it the carbon monoxide? Was it the malnutrition? Or was it just the brain trying to entertain itself in the void of winter? This state of semi-hibernation is something we have lost. We're on 24/7. They were off for months. They slowed down. They slept for 10 to 12 hours a day. In some ways, it was restorative. In others, it was maddening. We have arrived at the turning point, the winter solstice, the shortest day and the longest night of the year. In the medieval mind, this was a moment of cosmic anxiety. The sun had been getting weaker and weaker for months. What if it didn't come back? What if the darkness just stayed? To fight this fear, they didn't just light a candle, they lit the world on fire.
This is the origin of the Yule log. This wasn't the cute little chocolate cake you buy at the bakery today. This was an entire tree trunk, a massive oak log dragged from the forest by a team of men or oxen. They would haul it into the hearth. Remember, fireplaces in great halls were big enough to stand inside, and they would light it. And here is the rule: it had to keep burning. For the entire 12 days of Christmas, that log had to stay lit. If the fire went out, it was considered a terrible omen, like inviting death into the house for the coming year. So someone had the job of staying up, poking the fire, feeding the beast. It was a 24/7 vigil against the dark. Now forget everything you know about a quiet, peaceful Christmas morning. Medieval Christmas was a rager. It was loud, it was drunk, and it was chaotic. For most of the winter, society was strict. You knew your place. But for these 12 days, the world turned upside down. This was the time of the Lord of Misrule. In villages, in noble houses, even in the royal court, they would appoint a regular person, a peasant, a servant, maybe the village idiot, to be the king for the holidays. He was the Lord of Misrule. For 12 days, he gave the orders. And the actual lords and masters, they had to listen. It was like a pressure release valve for society. The peasants could mock the nobility, make silly laws, and demand feasts. It was a time when the strict rules of feudalism were suspended, just for a moment, so everyone could blow off some steam before going back to the grind. It was basically the office holiday party, but if the intern got to become the CEO for a week and tell everyone to wear funny hats. And the food.
Oh man, the food. If you were lucky enough to be invited to a feast in a great hall, you weren't just eating dinner, you were watching a show. Medieval people loved food theater. They called them subtleties. These were elaborate sculptures made of sugar, wax, and marzipan. But the main courses were even wilder. Imagine a boar's head roasted with an apple in its mouth, carried into the hall on a silver platter while musicians played a specific song just for the pig. Or a peacock, roasted but then redressed in its own feathers so it looked alive, breathing fire from its beak thanks to a little alcohol-soaked sponge. But here is the one that really freaks people out today, the cockatrice. Chefs would take the front half of a pig and sew it onto the back half of a turkey or a capon. They would roast this Frankenstein creation and serve it as a mythical beast. It was culinary special effects. Now, if you were a peasant, you weren't eating peacocks. But your landlord, the lord of the manor, was usually obligated to give you a Christmas treat. Maybe extra ale, a loaf of white bread, which was a huge luxury, or a mesmerizingly large portion of meat. For a few days, the gnawing hunger of winter was replaced by the warm buzz of ale and a full belly. Speaking of ale, let's talk about wassailing. You might know the carol, "Here We Come A-Wassailing," but the reality was a bit more pagan. In the apple-growing regions like England, winter was scary for the farmers. If the trees died, there would be no cider next year. So on the 12th night, the villagers would go out into the frozen orchards. They would carry a big bowl of hot spiced cider, the wassail bowl. They would pour cider on the roots of the trees to feed them. They would put pieces of cider-soaked toast in the branches to attract good spirits, and probably robins. And then they would make noise, a lot of noise. They would bang pots and pans, fire shotguns in later centuries, and shout at the trees. The idea was to wake up the sleeping tree spirits and scare away the demons of winter. Just picture a bunch of tipsy medieval farmers in the dead of night yelling at an apple tree in the snow. It sounds crazy to us, but to them it was agriculture. It was survival. But amidst the partying, there was a shiver down the spine. We associate ghosts with Halloween today, but in the Middle Ages, and actually all the way up to the Victorian era, the prime time for ghost stories was Christmas Eve. They believed the veil between the living and the dead was thinnest in the deep winter. The nights were so long, the shadows so deep, that the dead could slip through. People would gather around the fire and tell terrifying stories of spirits, revenants, and goblins.
This is actually why Charles Dickens wrote A Christmas Carol with ghosts. He wasn't inventing that, he was reviving an old tradition. There was also the legend of the Wild Hunt. On the stormiest winter nights, people believed a ghostly hunting party would ride across the sky. Led by a pagan god like Odin, or sometimes a figure like Herne the Hunter, they would sweep up souls. If you heard the wind howling down your chimney, you didn't just think bad weather, you thought the hunt is passing over. You locked your doors, barred your windows, and prayed they didn't stop at your house. If you are enjoying these spooky winter tales, this is a great time to check if you have hit that like button. It is a small click for you, but it helps us keep the ghosts away here at Dreamless Timelines. All good parties must come to an end. The 12 days passed, the Yule log burned down to ash, the Lord of Misrule went back to being a peasant. And then came the most depressing day of the year, Plough Monday. This was the first Monday after Epiphany. It marked the return to work. The holiday was over,
The ground might still be frozen, but it was time to prep the plows. There is something universally relatable about this. That feeling of waking up on a dark, cold Monday morning, knowing the fun is over, and you have to go back to the grind? That is not a modern feeling. That is a human feeling that spans centuries. The medieval peasant felt that same dread in the pit of their stomach as they looked at their frozen fields. Eventually, the grip of winter would loosen, but this brought a new danger, the thaw. We tend to think of spring as beautiful flowers and bunnies, but the early medieval spring was a muddy, watery disaster. All that snow we talked about, it melts. Rivers burst their banks. Bridges were swept away. The roads, which were passable when frozen, turned into thick, sucking swamps of mud. You could literally lose a horse in the mud. Travel became impossible again. And with the thaw came the smell. Remember all that waste, human and animal, that had been frozen and preserved under the snow for 4 months? It thawed out. The air in the villages became thick and heavy. This was also a dangerous time for health. The sudden shift in temperature, the dampness, the flooding, it was a breeding ground for fevers. Many people who had scraped through the starvation of winter died in the damp chill of March. It was the final hurdle of the marathon.
We have spent a lot of time in the mud with the peasants, and honestly, that is where the heart of the story is. But there was another group of people facing the winter, a group that chose silence and suffering as a way of life. The monks. Imagine a massive stone building sitting on a hill, exposed to the wind on all sides. Huge vaulted ceilings, beautiful architecture. But stone, as we mentioned before, is basically a battery for cold. In a peasant's hut, you had a fire in the middle of the room, animals breathing next to you, and a low ceiling keeping the heat in. A monastery was the opposite. It was designed to make you feel small, and in winter, it was designed to freeze you to the core. For a monk in the 1300s, winter was a test of faith. Most orders, like the Benedictines or the Cistercians, had strict rules against comfort. Comfort was a sin. So for the most part, there were no fires allowed in the sleeping quarters. Picture this. You wake up at 2 in the morning for matins, the night prayer. It is pitch black. The stone walls of your cell are covered in a thin layer of frost. You aren't wearing wool layers like the peasants. You are wearing a simple habit made of coarse cloth. You walk barefoot or in thin sandals through long, drafty stone corridors that act like wind tunnels. You arrive at the church, which is cavernous and freezing, and you have to stand there and sing for hours. If you stopped singing, your teeth would chatter so loud it would echo off the stone walls. But the real torture, and I mean real physical pain, happened in the scriptorium. This was the room where monks copied books by hand. It was their job, preserving knowledge, copying the Bible, writing chronicles. The scriptorium had to have big windows to let in natural light because candles were expensive and a fire hazard. Big windows in the Middle Ages meant big drafts. We actually have complaints written in the margins of medieval manuscripts by these monks. These are real little notes left by guys 700 years ago. One monk wrote in the margin of a book, "The ink is freezing in the pot." Another wrote, "Thank God it is night, for my fingers are dead." Just imagine that level of cold. You are trying to write beautiful calligraphy, but the ink is literally turning to ice on the tip of your quill. They had to keep a small candle or a heated stone next to the inkwell just to keep it liquid. Their hands were swollen with chilblains, which are painful, red, itchy swellings caused by the cold. Yet they sat there hour after hour, creating masterpieces in a freezer. This was a slow, quiet endurance. It wasn't the dramatic wolves attacking the city kind of danger. It was the danger of silence and slow hypothermia. There was, however, one oasis, one life raft in the sea of stone. It was called the calefactory, or the warming room. This was usually the only room in the entire monastery that had a fireplace. The monks were allowed to go there for brief periods to thaw out. Imagine the scene: 20 or 30 grown men, silent, shivering, huddled around one fire, rubbing their hands together trying to get the blood flowing again, just so they could go back to the library and write another page. It creates a cozy yet stark image, doesn't it? If you are tucked into bed right now, appreciate that warmth. You don't have to walk down a frozen stone corridor to get a glass of water. And hey, since you are warm and cozy, maybe hit that subscribe button for dreamless timelines. It helps us keep the lights on and the stories flowing. Now let's leave the monks and go up the hill to the castle. Surely the kings and queens, the dukes and duchesses were living the good life, right? Well, yes and no. A castle in winter was a very strange place. We look at them now and see romantic ruins, but back then they were military bunkers. They were built for defense, not for comfort. The windows were narrow slits called arrow loops that let in wind, but not much light. The rooms were massive. Have you ever tried to heat a gymnasium with a single fireplace? That was the reality of the Great Hall. The fireplace might be roaring. It might be big enough to roast a whole ox. But if you were standing 10 feet away from it, you were cold. If you were standing 20 feet away, you could see your breath. To combat this, the rich invented the concept of rooms within rooms. This is where those famous medieval tapestries come in. You see them in museums, big, heavy woven carpets that hung on walls. They weren't just art, they were insulation.
They hung them a few inches off the cold stone wall to create an air pocket. This stopped the cold from radiating into the room. Then around their beds, they hung heavy velvet curtains. When you went to sleep, you closed the curtains tight. You were basically sleeping inside a tent, inside a room, inside a castle. Here is a detail that movies always skip, but we love the gritty details here. Going to the bathroom in a castle in January. The toilet, called a garderobe, was essentially a hole in a stone bench that emptied out over the castle wall or into a moat. It was a small, jutting out room, usually high up in a tower. Because it stuck out from the wall, it was exposed to the wind on 3 sides. The wind would whistle up the chute, known as the updraft. So using the facilities in winter was a harrowing experience. It was freezing cold, drafty, and let's just say you didn't spend much time scrolling on your phone in there. You did your business and got back to the fire as fast as humanly possible. We talked about peasants being bored, but the nobility had a different kind of boredom. They were used to hunting, riding, and warring. Winter put a stop to all of that. So they became obsessed with games. Chess came to Europe around this time and became huge. Backgammon, dice, but also weird parlor games. There was a game called Hot Cockles. I am not making this up. It sounds weird, and it was.
Basically, one person was blindfolded and knelt down. The other nobles would take turns hitting them or slapping them on the back, and the blindfolded person had to guess who hit them. If they guessed right, the hitter became the blindfolded one. Picture a room full of kings and knights wearing furs worth more than a peasant's entire village, giggling and slapping each other in a dimly lit castle while a blizzard rages outside. It shows you that people, no matter how rich, will do anything to fight off the cabin fever. Let's circle back to food, but specifically the contrast. While the peasants were scraping the bottom of the barrel for grain, the rich were engaging in what I call aggressive eating. In the winter, fresh meat was rare for the poor, but the rich had deer parks, private forests, where they kept game alive just for them. So they were eating venison, they were eating swan. But the lack of vegetables was a problem for everyone. So the rich relied heavily on spices and sauces to mask the taste of preserved meat. They used saffron, ginger, cloves, and nutmeg. These spices had to be imported from the east, traveling thousands of miles. A pound of nutmeg could cost as much as a cow. So when a lord served a heavily spiced winter stew, he was basically eating money. He was showing off. Look at me. I can afford to make my mouth burn while it is freezing outside. But ironically, the rich often suffered from gout and other diseases because they refused to eat peasant food like vegetable pottage. The poor, if they had enough food, actually had a slightly more balanced diet of fiber and root vegetables, while the rich were just eating meat and pastry. We have talked about the normal winters, the ones that were hard but survivable. But what happens when the system breaks? What happens when the winter doesn't stop? We're going to move into a dark chapter now, the story of 1315, the beginning of the Great Famine. This wasn't just a cold snap. This was a climate disaster that nearly wiped out Northern Europe. It started with rain, then it turned to ice, and then the silence of the fields. If you think a regular winter is scary, wait until you hear about the winter when the bread ran out completely. Let's set the scene. It is 1315. The weather patterns go completely haywire. It starts raining in the spring, and it just never stops. The crops rot in the ground. The wheat turns to mush. Then the winter hits. Because the ground is so saturated with water, when the freeze comes, it turns the entire landscape into a sheet of hard rock ice. The salt mines couldn't work because they needed the sun to evaporate the brine. No sun meant no salt. No salt meant no preserved meat. It was a catastrophe. People were so hungry, they started eating their seed grain. This is a desperate move. Seed grain is what you save to plant next year. If you eat it now, you are guaranteeing that you will starve next year too. But hunger makes you do irrational things.
The chroniclers of the time wrote about people eating grass, eating cats, eating dogs, and eventually looking at the cemeteries with hungry eyes. It is the darkest timeline imaginable. But why are we talking about this in a sleep story? Because it highlights the resilience of the human spirit. Despite this apocalypse, despite the mud and the ice and the hunger, humanity didn't go extinct. They huddled closer. They shared what little they had. They hunkered down in those drafty huts, and they waited. And eventually, the sun did come back. It took years, but it came back. It is a reminder that no matter how long the winter is, spring is inevitable. Now, let's zoom in on a very specific, very boring task that was absolutely crucial for survival: spinning wool. If you were a woman in the Middle Ages, winter wasn't a time of rest. It was a time of spinning. You have probably seen pictures of Sleeping Beauty with a spinning wheel, but the spinning wheel wasn't actually invented or popular in Europe until later in the Middle Ages. For a long time, they used a drop spindle. It is a simple stick with a weight on it. You hold the wool in one hand and spin the stick with the other, twisting the fibers into thread. It is slow, it is tedious, and it takes forever. A woman had to spin constantly to make enough thread to weave into cloth to make clothes for her family. We're talking about walking around the house spinning while cooking, spinning while watching the kids, spinning while talking to neighbors. It was the background noise of winter, the hum of the spindle. Why is this important? Because cloth was armor. In a world without central heating, your clothes were your house. If you didn't have good, tight wool weave, the wind would kill you. So, while the men were outside repairing fences or hunting, the women were inside, literally weaving the shield that kept the family alive. It was a repetitive, meditative task. Twist, pull, spin. Twist, pull, spin. Hours and hours by the firelight. It is almost hypnotic to think about. The rhythm of survival. Let's take a moment to talk about the bed itself again, but this time the luxury version. We mentioned the curtains, but what about what was inside the mattress? If you were poor, you slept on straw. Straw is okay, but it breaks down, it gets dusty, and bugs love it. If you were rich, you slept on feathers. Goose down. A down mattress was the ultimate luxury. It was soft, it was warm, and it conformed to your body. But getting those feathers? That was a whole industry. Plucking geese was a winter job, and not a fun one, but the result was a cloud of warmth. The nobility would stack these mattresses, 3 or 4 of them. You needed a ladder to get into bed. Why so high? Because heat rises, and drafts stay low near the floor. Sleeping high up was a strategic move against the cold. And to make it even better, they used a bed warmer. This was a brass pan filled with hot coals from the fire, attached to a long wooden handle. Before you got into bed, a servant would slide this hot pan between the sheets to warm them up. Can you imagine the feeling of sliding into a preheated feather bed while the wind howls outside the castle walls? It must have felt like heaven. But let's step back outside for a moment, into the forest. We talked about wolves, but there was another danger in the woods: the trees themselves. In a deep freeze, trees can actually explode. It sounds like a gunshot. The sap inside the tree freezes and expands, and because the wood is frozen and brittle, it can't stretch, so crack, the tree splits open with a massive boom. If you were a woodcutter out in the forest gathering fuel, hearing these explosions around you would be terrifying. It would sound like the forest was under attack. It adds another layer to the auditory landscape of winter: the howling wind, the crunching snow, and the exploding trees. It is a hostile environment. And yet people had to work in it. The charcoal burners lived in the forest all winter. Charcoal was essential. It burns hotter than wood, and it's lighter to carry. These men lived in temporary huts right next to their slow-burning charcoal mounds. They were covered in soot,
black from head to toe. They were the outcasts of society, living in the wildest places. But without them, the blacksmiths couldn't forge tools, and the castles would be a lot colder. They were the unsung heroes of the winter economy. Let's talk about the sound of winter.
Have you ever noticed how snow changes the sound of the world? It acts as a dampener. It absorbs sound waves. After a heavy snowfall, the world goes quiet. A medieval village in deep winter would be eerily silent. No carts on the cobblestones, no animals grazing in the fields, just the muffled sound of footsteps and the wind. This silence was heavy. It amplified the feeling of isolation, but it also provided a rare peace. In the summer, the village was loud. Roosters, dogs, shouting, working, hammering. In the winter, the world took a breath. A long, slow, frozen breath. This silence is what we are looking for here at Dreamless Timelines. A space to quiet the mind. If you are finding that quiet place with us, don't forget to like this video so we can share the silence with others. Now, what about the children? Winter for a medieval child was a mix of danger and wonder. They didn't have school. Education wasn't really a thing for the masses, so they were home all day, every day. But they still played. Archaeologists have found ice skates from the Middle Ages, but they aren't like ours. They were made from the shin bones of horses or cows. They would file one side flat, drill holes for leather straps, and strap them to their boots. You couldn't really skate like a hockey player. You couldn't push off with the blade. Instead, you would stand on the bones and use a metal-tipped pole to push yourself along the ice, like you were skiing on a frozen lake. It was known as bone sliding. Imagine the village kids bundled up in sheepskins, sliding across the village pond, laughing their breath, puffing in the air, while the adults watched nervously, hoping the ice wouldn't crack. It is a moment of pure joy in a season of hardship. They also played with snowballs. We have illustrations in the margins of manuscripts showing people throwing snowballs. Some things never change. The urge to pack snow into a ball and throw it at your friend is apparently a universal human instinct encoded in our DNA. But children were also vulnerable. The infant mortality rate in winter was heartbreakingly high. This is the sad reality. The cold and the smoke took a toll on little lungs. This is why baptism was so important and happened so quickly. If a baby was born in winter, the priest would often rush to the house, or the family would rush to the church, regardless of the weather, because they were terrified for the child's soul. It adds a layer of urgency to the season. Every day of survival was a victory. Every morning you woke up was a blessing.
Let's move away from the frozen pond and head towards the one place in the village that was never cold, the blacksmith's forge. If the church was the soul of the village, the forge was its heart. And in winter, it was the most popular spot in town. Imagine the sensory shift. You walk out of the biting wind and the blinding white snow into a dark room illuminated by the glowing orange coals of the forge. The heat hits you like a physical wall. It smells of hot iron, charcoal, and sweat. The blacksmith was a busy man in winter. The frozen ground broke tools, plowshares snapped against hidden rocks. Horses slipped on the ice and needed special shoes with calkins. which are little spikes to help them grip the frozen roads. But the forge wasn't just a workshop, it was the unofficial clubhouse. Because fuel was so scarce at home, villagers would often find excuses to visit the smithy just to stand near the fire for a few minutes. They would bring a broken pot handle or a dull knife and stand there soaking up the warmth while the smith worked. The rhythmic clang of the hammer on the anvil was the heartbeat of the winter day. It was a reassuring sound that meant work was continuing, that civilization was holding together against the cold. While the smith sweated, the soldiers were shivering. War in the Middle Ages was seasonal. You generally didn't fight in the winter. It was a logistical nightmare. You couldn't move cannons or supply wagons through deep snow, and there was no grass for the thousands of horses to eat. So winter was a time of truce, but for a soldier garrisoned in a castle or a border fort, it was a time of crushing boredom and misery. Imagine standing guard duty on a stone wall at 3 a.m. in February. You are wearing chainmail. Metal gets very cold, it sucks the heat right out of your body, so you have to wear thick padded gambesons underneath, but even then the cold seeps through. You are standing still, scanning the white horizon for enemies that probably aren't coming. To pass the time and stay warm, soldiers would gamble, play dice, and drink. Garrison life was a mix of discipline and debauchery. They would spend hours polishing their armor because rust never sleeps, especially in the damp winter air. A rusty sword could snap in battle, so winter was the time for maintenance. Oiling the leather straps, sharpening the blades, repairing the fletching on arrows. It was busy work, designed to keep men from going crazy in the confinement of the barracks. Now, let's head into town for market day. You might think commerce stopped when the snow fell, but if anything, it became more intense. People needed things. They needed salt. They needed leather. They needed grain. The winter market was a sight to behold. Since the mud was frozen, carts and sleds could move easily. Merchants would set up stalls wrapped in layers of furs, looking like bears standing behind their tables. The colors would be striking against the gray and white background. Bright wools dyed in reds and blues, the glint of metalwares, and the steam. Steam rising from the hot food stalls. Yes, street food existed in the Middle Ages, and in winter, it was a lifesaver. You could buy a hot meat pie or a cup of warm ale. Imagine the taste of a hot, savory pie when you've been walking in the cold for 2 hours. It would taste like the best meal of your life. But the market was also a place of anxiety. Prices went up in winter. As the grain silos got emptier, the price of bread skyrocketed. If you were poor, you watched the prices climb week by week, wondering if your money would last until spring. It was a weekly reminder of the scarcity of the season. Traders who came from far away brought news. This was the medieval internet. A fur trader from Russia or a wool merchant from Flanders would bring stories of wars, kings, and plagues from other lands. People would gather around to hear the news, their breath misting in the air, hungry for information in a world that was usually very small. Let's dive deeper into the food situation again, but this time, the science of preservation. We talked about salt, but let's talk about smoke.
The smokehouse. This was a sacred place in the winter economy. If you killed a pig in November, you couldn't eat it all at once. You had to make it last. So you hung the hams and sausages in a smokehouse. This wasn't a quick process. It was a slow, cold smoke. You would burn specific types of wood, like oak or apple, to give it flavor. The smoke dehydrates the meat and creates an acidic coating that kills bacteria. The smell of wood smoke and curing meat is one of the defining scents of the medieval winter. It is the smell of safety. If you had a smokehouse full of ham, you knew you weren't going to starve. Then there was pickling. They didn't just pickle cucumbers, they pickled everything. Walnuts, eggs, fish, even fruits. They used vinegar and verjuice, which is the sour juice of unripe grapes. The biting sour taste of pickled vegetables was a sharp contrast to the bland pottage they ate every day. It provided essential acid and variety. Fermentation was another hero. Sauerkraut, or fermented cabbage, was popular in many parts of Europe. It is full of vitamin C, though they didn't know that. They just knew that people who ate the sour cabbage didn't get the sickness where their teeth fell out. It was accidental nutritional science. Let's shift gears to the spiritual calendar. Winter wasn't just one long block of time. It was punctuated by holy days. We talked about Christmas, but there is another huge milestone. Candlemas, February 2nd. This is the halfway point between the winter solstice and the spring equinox. In the church, this was the feast of the presentation of Jesus. But for the people, it was the festival of light. On this day, everyone would bring their candles to the church to be blessed. The priest would bless the beeswax candles that would be used for the rest of the year. Imagine the visual: a stone church filled with hundreds of people, each holding a flickering candle, the smell of beeswax and incense filling the cold air. It was a symbol of hope, a reminder that the light was returning. This day also had a lot of weather superstition attached to it. There was an old saying, "If Candlemas Day be fair and bright, winter will have another flight. If Candlemas Day be clouds and rain, winter is gone and will not come again." This is actually the medieval ancestor of Groundhog Day. They believed that if the weather was nice on February 2nd, it meant winter would drag on. If it was stormy, it meant spring was coming early. People would watch the sky, anxiously hoping for clouds. Following Candlemas came the most difficult spiritual challenge of the year: Lent. Lent usually falls in late winter or early spring. It is the 40 days of fasting before Easter. Now, imagine this. You have been struggling to survive winter for 3 months. You are tired. You are cold. Your food stores are running low. And now the church tells you that you have to fast. No meat, no eggs, no dairy for 40 days. It seems cruel to us, but it was strictly enforced. If you were caught eating meat during Lent, you could be fined or punished. So what did they eat? Fish. If you lived near the sea, you had fresh fish. But if you lived inland, you ate stockfish. Stockfish is cod that has been dried in the cold wind until it is hard as a piece of wood. It keeps forever, but you have to beat it with a hammer and soak it in water for days to make it edible. The smell of soaking stockfish is pungent. It was the taste of penance. The rich, however, found loopholes. They ate beaver tails because medieval science classified beavers as fish since they swam in water. They ate porpoise. They ate elaborate dishes made to look like meat but made of fish. But for the common person, Lent was a time of spiritual focus and physical hunger. It was the final sprint of the winter marathon. But let's look at the night sky again. Winter offers the clearest skies. The cold air holds less moisture, so there is less haze. In a world without light pollution, the medieval night sky was blindingly bright. The Milky Way looked like a solid cloud of light. The stars were used for navigation and for telling time, but they were also the calendar. Farmers knew that when certain stars appeared on the horizon, it was time to start preparing the plows. They felt a connection to the cosmos that we have lost. They navigated their lives by the slow turning of the great wheel of the sky. Let's talk about the alehouse again. We mentioned it briefly, but it deserves a deeper look.
The medieval alehouse wasn't a bar in the modern sense. It was usually just someone's house, often a widow who brewed good ale. She would put a pole with a bush on the end of it outside her door. This was the ale stake. It signaled that the brew was ready. Inside, it was dark, smoky, and crowded, but it was warm. People sat on benches, playing dice, sharing gossip, and complaining about the cold. It was the social news feed. If you wanted to know who was getting married, who had died, or what the Lord was up to, you went to the alehouse. The ale served there wasn't like modern beer. It was thick, almost like liquid bread, and it was packed with calories. For a peasant running on empty, a tankard of thick ale was a meal in itself. It provided the energy needed to keep shivering, to keep working. But it also brought problems. Drunkenness in winter was dangerous. If you passed out in a ditch on the way home in July, you woke up with a headache. If you passed out in a ditch in January, you didn't wake up. The coroner's rolls from the Middle Ages are full of records of people found dead in the snow after a night at the alehouse. It was a tragic but common end. Now, let's look at the animals again, but the wild ones, the birds. We talked about wolves, but what about the birds? The silence of winter was broken by the crows and the ravens. These are intelligent birds. In the winter, they became bolder. They would watch the humans. They knew that humans meant food, scraps, garbage, or the results of a hunt. The sight of a raven on a bare branch against a gray sky is a classic medieval image. It was seen as an omen, sometimes bad, sometimes good. But the smaller birds, the robins and the sparrows, relied on the charity of the villagers. There was a belief that feeding the birds in winter brought good luck. People would leave crumbs on their windowsills. It was a small act of kindness in a harsh world, a recognition that all living things were in this together. Let's go back inside the castle for a moment, to the solar. The solar was the private living quarters of the lord and lady, usually on an upper floor. It was the most comfortable room in the castle. It had a fireplace, maybe even a window with glass, which was incredibly rare and expensive. In here, the lady of the castle would oversee the domestic duties. Embroidery was a huge winter pastime, but it wasn't just a hobby. They were creating the tapestries and clothes we talked about. It was intense, detailed work done by the light of beeswax candles. The women would sit together, talking, singing, and sewing. It was a female sanctuary within the military fortress. They would tell stories of courtly love, of knights and dragons, creating a fantasy world to escape the dreary view from the window. The contrast between the delicate silk threads they were weaving and the rough stone walls around them is striking. Beauty and harshness, side by side. We have to talk about the shoes. You can't survive winter with bad shoes. Medieval shoes were mostly made of leather, turn shoes where the sole is sewn to the upper inside out and then turned. But leather is slippery on ice. We mentioned the horses having spikes, but people had to improvise. They would wrap their boots in wool or burlap to get grip. They would stuff the insides with straw for insulation. A good pair of boots was a prized possession. If a person died, their boots were immediately taken by someone else. You didn't bury good leather. The cobbler was another busy man in winter, constantly repairing split seams and patching holes. He would use beeswax and animal fat to waterproof the leather. The smell of a cobbler's shop, leather and grease, is another scent of the season. Keeping your feet dry was a matter of life and death. Wet feet meant trench foot, gangrene, and amputation.
and medieval amputation is a road we do not want to go down tonight. So people were obsessive about their feet, checking them, warming them by the fire, greasing their boots. It was a daily ritual. Let's touch on the rivers again. But the trade. When the rivers weren't frozen, they were dangerous. Winter floods were common. A sudden rain could swell a river, washing away mills and bridges. The miller, who ran the watermill, was in a constant state of anxiety.
His livelihood depended on the water, but too much water would destroy his wheel. He had to go out in the freezing rain to adjust the sluice gates, fighting the current to save his mill. It was a dangerous, wet, cold job. The mill was another gathering place as people brought their grain to be ground into flour. The sound of the grinding stones was another part of the winter soundscape, a low rumble that could be heard for miles. As we move through February, the days start to get noticeably longer. The light changes. It goes from the flat gray of deep winter to a sharper, brighter blue. The shadows get shorter. This shift in light triggered a biological response in both humans and animals. You could feel the end approaching. But this was the danger zone. The food stores are at their lowest. The firewood pile is a few lonely logs. This is when the discipline of rationing really mattered. The mother of the family had to be the enforcer. She had to look at the sack of flour and say, "We can only have one loaf today because we don't know when the thaw is coming." It was a game of chicken with nature. Can we make these beans last until the first greens appear? The tension in the house would be high, but so would be the anticipation. They would look for signs, the first snowdrop flower pushing through the ice, the first buds on the willow trees. These were celebrated like victories, the return of life, the cycle continuing.
While the farmers were anxiously watching their grain sacks, the shepherds were facing their own battle on the hills. Late winter is lambing season. It is the most critical time of the year for a shepherd. If the lambs die, the economy of the village collapses. So the shepherd didn't sleep at home. He slept in a small wooden box on wheels called a shepherd's hut. It was the original mobile home. Inside, there was a tiny stove, a narrow bed, and just enough room to turn around. It was parked right in the middle of the field. Imagine the scene. It is 3 a.m. The wind is howling across the open moors. The shepherd is awake, listening. He knows the sound of a ewe in distress. He has to go out into the freezing dark with nothing but a lantern. He has to help deliver the lamb in the snow. If a lamb was born too weak or too cold, he would bring it inside the hut. He would wrap it in wool and warm it by the tiny stove. Sometimes he would put the lamb inside his own coat, against his skin, to share his body heat. It is a moment of extreme tenderness in a brutal environment. The rough, calloused hands of the shepherd saving a tiny, fragile life from the winter storm. This cycle of birth in the midst of death is a powerful theme. The steam rising from the flock in the cold morning air. The bleeding of new life. It was a sign that the wheel was turning even if the snow was still deep. Now, let's leave the fields and get back on the road. We talked about travel, but where did you stay? If you weren't a lord, you didn't have a castle. You stayed at a wayside inn.
The medieval inn was an assault on the senses. You would see it from a distance, a light in the window and a painted sign swinging and creaking in the wind. Maybe the sign was a red lion or a white swan. You would push open the heavy oak door and be hit with a wall of noise and heat. The common room would be packed. Merchants, pilgrims, messengers, and locals all crammed together near the fire. The air would be thick with the smell of roasting meat, spilled ale, and wet dogs. It was loud, but it was warm. And after a day of walking in the sleet, it felt like a palace. Ordering food was simple. You ate what was in the pot, usually a perpetual stew that had been simmering for days, constantly topped up with whatever ingredients were available. But the sleeping arrangements, that is where it gets interesting for modern minds. You didn't rent a room, you rented a spot in a bed. And these beds were huge. You might be sharing a mattress with 2 or 3 strangers. You would take off your boots and maybe your outer coat, but you slept in your clothes. You huddled together for warmth. It was intimate, but strictly practical. You had to trust that the guy next to you wasn't going to pick your pocket or give you fleas. Speaking of fleas, they were a constant companion. In winter, they sought warmth, just like humans. People carried sashes of dried herbs like lavender or wormwood in their pockets to ward them off. It didn't really work, but the smell was nice. The inn was also a place of music. Someone might have a lute or a pipe. They would sing ballads to pass the long evening. Songs of Robin Hood were huge in this era. Stories of a man living free in the forest, sticking it to the man, were very popular with the peasants who felt crushed by taxes and the weather. Singing together was a way to bond, to forget the cold outside for a few hours. Now, let's open the medicine cabinet. We touched on the 4 humors, but let's look at specific winter remedies. The most common problem was the cough, the lung rot. Without antibiotics, a chest infection could be a death sentence. So they had the still room. In a large manor house or a monastery, the still room was where they distilled herbs and made medicines. For a cough, they would make a syrup of horehound. Horehound is a bitter herb that actually works as an expectorant. They would mix it with honey to make it palatable. This is actually the great-grandfather of the modern cough drop. They also used colt's foot, another herb that looks a bit like a dandelion. They would smoke the dried leaves to help with asthma or breathing trouble. Yes, smoking to help the lungs. It sounds counterintuitive, but they believed the smoke carried the healing properties deep into the chest. Then there were chilblains. We mentioned these red, itchy swellings on the fingers and toes. They drove people mad. The cure? Goose grease. They would smear rendered fat from a goose onto their hands. If that didn't work, they might try mixing it with roasted onions. Or in really rural areas, they might use urine. The ammonia in urine has some antiseptic properties, but mostly it was just warm. Imagine going to bed with hands smelling of onions and goose fat. But if it stopped the itching, you did. For aches and pains, rheumatism, which flared up in the damp cold, they used willow bark.
They would chew on the bark of the white willow tree. This bark contains salicin, which is the active ingredient in aspirin. So they were basically taking natural aspirin for their joint pain. They didn't know the chemistry, but they knew the tree took the pain away. For the wealthy, medicine got weird. They believed in the power of gemstones. They thought that sapphires and rubies had internal heat. A rich merchant might hold a ruby in his hand, or even grind up pearls into his wine, hoping to absorb the mineral warmth. It was expensive, placebo magic. But let's go deeper into the mind. The winter blues, melancholy. They had a cure for that too. Borage, an herb with a blue flower. The old saying went, "I borage, bring always courage." They would steep it in wine to lift the spirits. It was an antidepressant wine. They also prescribed music and pleasant smells. Doctors would literally tell patients to smell apples or dried roses to fight the winter sadness. It shows a surprisingly holistic approach. They knew the mind and body were connected. Let's shift to a very specific domestic task, making candles. In the winter, you burned candles constantly. Buying them was expensive, so most people made their own. Rushlights were the poor man's candle. You would take a reed from the river, peel off the skin, leaving the pith, and dip it in melted animal fat. It burned fast and smoky, giving off a dim, sputtering light. But it was free. Making them was a greasy, smelly job done by the fire. The smell of burning mutton fat is distinct. It is the smell of a peasant winter evening. Beeswax candles were the gold standard. They smelled like honey and burned clean. But only the church and the rich could afford them. The church used thousands of them. The flickering of hundreds of beeswax candles against the gold leaf of an altar was probably the most beautiful thing a medieval person ever saw. It was a glimpse of heaven in a dark world. Let's talk about the wolves one more time, but in a different context. Folklore. The wolf was the villain of the medieval imagination. This is why Little Red Riding Hood exists. These stories were warnings. Don't go into the woods. Don't stray from the path. In the winter, parents would tell these stories to terrify their children into staying close to the house. Fear was a survival tool. If a child was afraid of the big bad wolf, they wouldn't wander off into the snowdrift. There were also stories of changelings. The belief that fairies or spirits would steal a human baby and replace it with a sickly fairy child. This often happened in winter when babies were weak and pale from lack of sun. If a baby wasn't thriving, parents would whisper that it was a changeling. It is a heartbreaking explanation for winter sickness and malnutrition. They didn't have the medical words, so they used magic words. To protect the house, they put iron over the door. A horseshoe. Iron was believed to repel spirits. They would sprinkle salt on the threshold. These rituals gave them a sense of control. When the wind is screaming like a banshee and you are freezing in the dark, you need to feel like you can do something to keep the monsters out. Let's look at the clothing again, but specifically the laundry. How do you wash clothes in winter? You don't, really. Washing wool involves soaking it in water and pounding it. If you do that in freezing temperatures, the clothes freeze into boards. And drying them? Impossible. Wet wool takes days to dry in a damp hut. So people just didn't wash their outer layers. They would brush them. They would hang them over herbs to mask the smell. But the linen undergarments had to be washed because of lice. They would do a quick wash in a bucket by the fire, and hang the linen on ropes strung across the room near the ceiling where the heat was. The humidity in the hut would be intense. A fog of drying laundry, smoke, and cooking steam. It was a greenhouse of smells. Let's talk about the elderly. Winter was hardest on them. The old notion of the grandmother sitting by the fire wasn't just a stereotype, it was a medical necessity. The family would give the warmest spot to the elders. Their wisdom was valuable. They knew how to survive because they had done it 50 times before. They were the keepers of the oral history.
Grandfather would tell you exactly how high the snow was in the winter of 1342. He would tell you which berries were safe to eat when the food ran out. Keeping the elders alive was keeping the library of survival skills intact. But often, winter took them. Pneumonia was called the old man's friend because it brought a peaceful, unconscious end to a hard life. Funerals in winter were difficult. The ground was frozen. You couldn't dig a grave. So what did they do? They had to wait. They would place the body in a coffin, if they could afford one, or wrapped in a shroud, and store it in the coldest part of the church or a specially built lich gate until the ground thawed. It is a macabre detail, but it was just logistics. Death didn't stop because the ground was hard. Let's zoom out to the landscape again, the fens and the marshes. In places like the Netherlands or the east of England, there were vast wetlands. In winter, these flooded and froze. The locals here lived a different life. They were master skaters. They used sleds to move goods across the flat, frozen expanse. They hunted waterfowl, ducks and geese migrating south. They would use nets and decoys. Fresh meat was easier to come by in the wetlands. These people were known as slodgers or fen men. They walked on stilts to keep out of the freezing mud. Seeing a figure walking on stilts through the mist across a frozen marsh is a haunting image. They were adapted to their wet, frozen world in a way the city dwellers weren't. Let's talk about the luxury of glass. We mentioned windows. Most people had shutters. When you closed the shutter, it was dark. But by the late Middle Ages, the very rich started to have glass windows, but not clear glass. It was often thick bottle glass or diamond-shaped panes held together with lead. It distorted the view, but it let in light and kept out the wind. Sitting in a sunbeam inside a warm room while looking out at the snow was the ultimate flex. It was a mastery over nature. You could see the winter, but you didn't have to feel it. For a few minutes a day, a cat might curl up in that sunbeam. Cats were everywhere. They were essential for pest control. In winter, cats became very friendly. They would sleep on the beds, on the people, on the hearth. A purring cat was a small, vibrating heater, and they were respected for it. There is a medieval poem written by a monk about his cat, Pangur Bon. He writes about how he hunts words, and his cat hunts mice, and they are both happy in their work. It is a sweet reminder that people loved their pets back then, just as we do now. As we near the end of this section, let's think about the anticipation of the thaw, the sound of dripping water,
the icicles melting. It starts as a slow drip, drip, drip from the eaves. It is the sound of the world waking up. The ice on the river starts to groan and crack. Huge plates of ice break free and crash downstream. It is violent and loud. The transition from winter to spring isn't a gentle fade, it is a breakup. The earth is shaking off the shell of ice. And for the people huddling in the dark, that sound of cracking ice was the most beautiful music in the world. It meant they had made it. They had survived another rotation of the seasons.
Let's pull our chairs closer to the fire and look at the hands of the people sitting there. What are they doing? They are whittling. Wood carving was the universal pastime of the winter evening. If you needed a spoon, you made it. If you needed a bowl, you carved it. The men would take pieces of seasoned wood, usually ash or beech, and slowly, methodically shave away the layers. The curls of wood would fall into the fire, creating little flares of light. It was meditative. Scrape, scrape, scrape. They made toys for the children, little wooden horses or soldiers. They made intricate handles for their tools. Some of the most beautiful medieval art wasn't made by famous artists, but by anonymous peasants sitting by a fire in February, just trying to keep their hands busy. The floor around the hearth would be covered in wood shavings, which would then be swept into the fire as kindling. Nothing was wasted. Now, let's move to the kitchen of a large manor house. It is a hive of activity. The heat here is intense. The fireplaces are cavernous, and in the corner there is a strange piece of technology. A large wooden wheel mounted on the wall, connected to the spit where the meat is roasting. And inside the wheel, running endlessly, is a small dog. This is the turnspit dog, a specific breed that is now extinct. They were long-bodied and short-legged like a dachshund. Their job was to run in the wheel to turn the roast so the kitchen staff didn't have to. It was a hard life for the dog, but it was warm. On cold nights, the cooks would let the turnspit dogs sleep near the ashes. It is a bizarre image, a dog running on a hamster wheel to cook the Lord's dinner. But it shows the ingenuity of the time. Every source of energy was used, even dog power. Let's talk about the smell of clean laundry, or the lack thereof. We mentioned washing clothes, but what about the soap? They made their own. It was a mixture of animal fat and lye, which they got from wood ash. It was harsh. It would burn your skin if you used too much. Soft soap, which was black and goopy, was used for clothes. Hard soap, which was a luxury, was imported from Castile in Spain.
If you smelled Castile soap on someone, you knew they were rich. But mostly, people smelled of smoke. Wood smoke permeates everything: hair, skin, clothes. In the winter, everyone walked around in a cloud of campfire smell. It was the natural perfume of the era. Let's go back to the scribes for a moment. We talked about freezing ink, but what about the paper? They didn't use paper. They used parchment or vellum, which is made from animal skin. Preparing parchment is a winter job. You have to soak the skin in lime, then stretch it on a wooden frame and scrape it with a crescent-shaped knife called a lunellum. Scrape, scrape, scrape. It had to be done carefully. If you cut the skin, it was ruined. The sound of the knife scraping the dry skin was the soundtrack of the monastery workshop. It produced a fine white dust, so the monks would be covered in this white powder, looking like ghosts in the candlelight. It was tedious, exacting work, but the result was a material that could last for 1,000 years. And it has. We are reading their words today because they endured the cold to write them down. Let's talk about the night watch. In a walled city like York or London, the gates were locked at dusk, but someone had to patrol the walls. The night watchman. These were ordinary citizens who were rostered to do the job. Walking the stone battlements in January was a punishment. The wind would whip over the parapets. You carried a lantern and a staff. You were looking for fires mostly. A fire in a wooden city was the end of the world. You were also looking for night walkers, people out after curfew. If you found someone, you would challenge them. "Who goes there?" The voice would be muffled by a scarf. It was a lonely, thankless job. But looking down at the sleeping city, seeing the snow-covered roofs and the faint glow of embers from the chimneys, there must have been a sense of peace. You were the guardian of the sleep. Let's address the pests again. Lice. Everyone had them. Kings had them. Peasants had them. In winter, when you were wearing 5 layers of wool and never taking them off, the lice thrive. Delousing was a social activity. You would see monkeys grooming each other in nature documentaries, while humans did the same. A mother would pick through her child's hair by the firelight. It was a grooming ritual. They used fine-toothed combs made of bone or wood. Finding a louse and cracking it was a small victory. It sounds gross to us, but it was just a fact of life, like brushing your teeth. Let's talk about the floors of the castle again. We mentioned rushes, but in the solar, the Lord's private room, they might use woven mats made of straw. These were warmer and cleaner. And on the walls, they might have paintings, not on canvas, but painted directly onto the plaster. Frescoes. In the winter, the damp would sometimes damage these paintings. You can imagine the Lord grumbling as a piece of his expensive painted wall flaked off due to the frost. Maintaining a castle was a constant battle against the elements. The mortar between the stones would freeze and crack. Every spring, they had to repoint the masonry. The castle was a living thing that needed constant care. Let's look at the darker side of commerce. The grain hoarders. In every village, there was usually someone who held back grain waiting for the price to peak in February. These people were hated. Sermons were preached against them. They were called engrossers. If a hoarder was caught, they might be put in the pillory. Imagine standing in the pillory in the town square in the freezing wind while your neighbors threw rotten vegetables or snowballs at you. It was public shaming. Justice in the Middle Ages was swift and visible. Let's talk about the silence of the snow one more time.
Deep snow acts as an insulator for the ground. Farmers actually wanted a good layer of snow. They called it the poor man's fertilizer. Why? Because it protected the seeds in the ground from the hard frost. If the ground was bare and the temperature dropped to -20, the seeds would die. If there was a blanket of snow, the ground stayed just around freezing. So a snowy winter was actually seen as a good omen for the harvest. It is a paradox. The snow that killed travelers saved the crops. Let's move to the apothecary's shop, the pharmacist of the day. His shop would be filled with jars of dried herbs, roots, and strange powders. In winter, he sold a lot of theriac. Theriac was a master medicine, a black, sticky treacle made of dozens of ingredients, including viper flesh and opium. It was the cure-all. If you had a fever, take theriac. If you had the plague, take theriac. It was expensive, but in the desperation of winter sickness, people would pay anything. The apothecary would mix it in a ceramic mortar, the grinding sound adding to the noise of the town.
The smell of the shop would be a mix of dried sage, mint, and musk. A sharp medicinal smell that cut through the wood smoke. Let's talk about the heavy woolen cloaks. A cloak wasn't just a garment. It was a blanket. It was a tent. It was a bag. People would wax their cloaks to make them waterproof, rubbing beeswax and oil into the fibers. It made the cloak heavy and stiff, but it kept the sleet out. When you walked into a warm room, the wax would soften and smell like honey. A wet wool cloak drying by the fire smells like a wet dog, but a waxed cloak smells like a candle. It is a sensory detail that brings the scene to life. Now let's look at the transition to spring, the Lent lily. This is the daffodil. When the first yellow daffodil appeared, it was a signal. The long fast was almost over. The color yellow was starving from the landscape for months. Everything had been gray, white, and brown. Seeing that bright yellow flower was a shock to the system. It was visual nutrition. Children would run to pick them, but were often told not to bring them inside because of superstitions. A single daffodil brought inside was bad luck for the chickens. Don't ask me why. That is just what they believed. Let's talk about the plow again. Plow Sunday. The first Sunday after Epiphany. The plow was blessed in the church. They would literally drag the heavy wooden plow into the church, up to the altar. The priest would sprinkle it with holy water. It shows how deeply religion and agriculture were intertwined. The tool that broke the earth was sacred. Without the plow, there is no bread. Without bread, there is no life. The men would stand around, their caps in their hands, looking at this piece of wood and iron, praying for a soft earth and a good year. It is a solemn moment before the back-breaking work begins. As the days lengthen, the mud returns. We cannot overstate the mud. We call it mud, but they called it mire. It was deep, sticky, and everywhere. You needed pattens. Pattens were wooden overshoes, blocks of wood carved to fit under your leather boots to lift you up out of the muck. They clicked and clacked on the cobblestones. The sound of spring was the click-clack of pattens and the squelch of mud. The roads became impassable again. The easy travel of the frozen winter was over. You were stuck in your village until the sun dried the earth. This period of being mud-bound was a time of cleaning,
Spring cleaning is a real historical thing. You had to sweep out the old rushes from the floor, the ones that had been there for 4 months. You shoveled them out and burned them. You opened the shutters. You let the wind blow through the house. You whitewashed the walls with lime to kill the bugs. It was a rebirth, a shedding of the winter skin. The house felt bigger, brighter, and colder, actually, because the insulation of dirt was gone, but it felt clean. Let's conclude our journey. We have survived. We started in the dark terror of December. We hunkered down through the starvation of January. We endured the wet chill of February. And now the sun is higher. The birds are singing the dawn chorus, which sounds like a symphony after the silence. You have made it. The medieval winter was a beast, but humanity was stubborn. We built fires, we told stories, we shared warmth, and we waited. The timeline of history is paved with these winters. Every ancestor you have survived this winter. You are here because they didn't freeze. You are the result of their resilience. So as you drift off to sleep tonight in your warm bed with your thermostat set to 70 degrees, spare a thought for the people in the wattle and daub hut, and let their strength comfort you. You are safe, you are warm, and the spring is always coming. This has been a production of Dreamless Timelines. Thank you for listening. If this story helped you find the quiet in the chaos, please subscribe and share it with a friend who needs some sleep. Good night, and sweet dreams.